He is deaf to all appeals. He won't relent. The fates bar the way, and heaven blocks his gentle human ears, as firm as a sturdy oak, grown tough with age. When the north winds blasting off the Alps compete, fighting left and right to wrench it from the earth, and the wind screams, the trunk shudders. Its leafy crest showers cross the ground, but it clings firm to its rock, its roots stretching as deep into the dark world below, as its crown goes towering toward the gales of heaven. So firm the hero stands, battered left and right by storms of appeals. He takes the full force of love and suffering deep in his great heart. His will stands unmoved. The falling tears are futile. Oh, thank God that's over. Hi, me again, and we're going to talk about the Aeneid by Virgil, and I don't really know why I read, by the way, that's from book 4. I don't really know why I read that in a vaguely British accent. That's just what you do, you know, when you, I mean, you've seen Rome and Spartacus. That's how they do it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the historical backdrop to Virgil's great poem, the Aeneid, that set the mythological foundation for the Roman state. So the first thing I'm going to do, talk about my equipment, which will give me an excuse to take off this helmet. First of all, I'm wearing, this is not what an average Roman soldier would wear. This would be what a centurion would wear. A centurion is going to be like a non-commissioned officer, sort of like a sergeant who leads between 80 and 100 men. And so he's going to wear a little bit fancier armor. The musculus musculata had already kind of gone out of style by the time Virgil writes the Aeneid, but nevertheless, wealthier officers would sometimes buy these cuirasses at their own expense. I've also got, I recycled my wristbands and my greaves from the Greek outfit, so sue me. And this helmet is what's called an early imperial style. Got the lobster pot on the back, the hinged cheek pieces, and then I've got what's called a transverse crest. In a lot of artwork, you'll see Greek and Roman soldiers wearing fore and aft crest, front to back, as in the last video I did with the Corinthian helmet, but this is transverse. It means it goes across. Roman centurions often wore that to distinguish them for their own troops in battle. Okay, well, we're going to move on, and I'm going to take this bloody thing off, and as comfortable as it is, and wow, it is comfortable, I'm going to set this over here, and we will continue. Okay. So, what we're going to do, Rome, I mean, you guys know this just from watching popular entertainment, whether it's HBO series or Starz series, or, you know, Rome has always captured the Western imagination. Many people believe that in terms of grandeur, it was sort of the peak of Western civilization, if not in terms of, diplomacy and gentility and things like that. The Roman Empire was rather brutal, and indeed, the Aeneid, even though it was written before Rome became an empire, is going to give us a hint into that destiny for the state. We know that often it's very common for political commentators on both sides of the fence to compare the United States with Rome, usually in the sense that the United States is declining just as Rome declined. And you'll hear a lot of the same parallels drawn by people that many commentators in the late empire did as far as the problems Rome was facing. There's also something very inarguable about Rome, and that is that it was very arrogant. And most of the time it believed that it was civilization, and anything outside of its borders could not be civilization. And that's kind of familiar. We run into that today too from a lot of different countries. So what we're going to do is talk about again, the historical backdrop to the Aeneid and how that influenced a lot of Rome's later actions. So Rome itself is founded, we believe, in about the 8th century BC on the banks of a river in Italy, and where it still stands today, founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus, and eventually the two brothers fight and Remus is killed. And Romulus, for whom the city is named, goes on to be the first leader of the city. Now that is not history, that's mythology. But nevertheless, we do believe that Rome was founded in about that time. Rome was first a kingdom, just one city. It began to expand, it began to conquer its neighbors. And one thing that's always going to be true about the Romans is that, well, for one thing, they're very aggressive. Number two, they believe that they are spreading their own civilization, and that's a good thing, that these people who live outside of their borders deserve to have Roman civilization. It's the exact same thing that's going to happen later in the 18th and 19th centuries with colonialism. But at any rate, and the third thing that Rome does is they are brilliant at adapting innovations from other cultures. They have no problem stealing what works from other cultures, and that's one of the reasons why they endure as long as they do, or their lifestyle endures as long as it does. Okay, so Rome has three periods. Very early, a kingdom. That ends in about the 6th century BC. Then you have, and this is what really makes Rome unusual and unique among states of the ancient world, it is a republic. Now, we get that word from the Latin. Latin, of course, is the language the Romans spoke, and it's the language in which Virgil wrote. And republic means a situation of governance that is in the public interest. In other words, it's not just one guy up on his throne saying, you will do this, and that's the end of it. You don't have any say. A republic, it isn't always a democracy, but a republic means that the citizens do have a vested interest in what happens. They're not just cattle to be pushed around. Their opinion matters, or we should say their contentment matters. So the republic is led by a senate, the Roman Senate, and that's where we get our word. There is an entire class of Roman society called the senatores, and those are very, very wealthy men, and only they can serve in the Senate. And the Senate determines the course of the state. They determine policy, they determine military policy. So the Senate calls the shots, and that's very unusual for the ancient world for a group that large, usually between 500 and 900 men, to determine the course of a state's destiny as opposed to just one man. So the Republic lasts until around 44 BC, and that is when Julius Caesar is assassinated. Now, Julius Caesar was a powerful Roman general in the Republican period, in the very end of the Republican period, and he got into, to simplify things greatly, he got into a disagreement with the Senate. The Senate said, you're becoming too powerful, you're getting too greedy. Caesar said, oh really, and marched into Italy. He and his armies had been campaigning in Gaul, what is now France. Anyway, Caesar, the Senate, they get into it. Caesar comes back, overthrows the Senate. The Senate still exists, but they don't have as much power, and Caesar is named dictator. So it's not the first time in Rome's history they've had one man calling all the shots, but it's a definite change from the Republican period. So we're no longer a republic. Well, Caesar, for this very reason, is soon assassinated. He is murdered. And in the wake of his death, a civil war rages and rips Rome apart. On one side, of course, are a group of men who want to return power to the Senate. On the other side are people who were in Caesar's camp, who again want the state to be in the control of one strong man, or maybe just a handful of strong men. So civil war rages, and even though Caesar's dead, his side wins, and that's going to be led by Gaius Octavius. And we're going to call him later Augustus. He's going to be the first Roman emperor. So Octavius wins the civil war. It's, again, simplifying things. And really his name's Octavian. But regardless, he wins. Okay, so shortly after he wins, he goes before the Senate, which, again, the Senate still exists. It just doesn't have as much power. He's in control. He goes before the Senate and he says, you know, I don't want you to think I'm greedy, so I'm going to give you all of my powers. It was a very calculated political move. The Senate, knowing that the army was behind Octavian, says, oh, please, no, you keep the power, by all means. And he says, well, okay, I don't really want to, but I will. Of course, that wasn't true. He did want it, but he did take it. But he did not call himself an emperor, and we need to keep that in mind. For a couple of hundred years, Roman emperors did not call themselves emperors. They were usually called primus optimus, which in Latin is first citizen. It was a way for them to say, yeah, I'm in control, but I'm not a king. I'm not an emperor. Don't look at me that way. It was sort of disingenuous. It really was not an honest way of approaching the situation, but politically it was necessary. Okay, so anyway, all this happens, and that leaves our man Octavian, his name is now changed to Augustus, meaning the solemn one, the wise one, the powerful one, and it's after him that our month August is named, just like July is named after Julius Caesar. In any case, Augustus is in control, and this is where Virgil comes into the picture. Virgil is born in Mantua, and it took him about 10 years to write the Aeneid. And we need to talk about why he wrote it and what role it plays in Roman history. All right, so we need to get one thing straight. Even though the Aeneid is written by a Roman about a man who was going to start the city of Rome, that's Aeneas, nevertheless, it's set at a time much earlier than Rome existed. It's set at the time of the Trojan War. Trojan War happened, if it happened, sometime around the 9th or 8th centuries BC. We know there was a Troy. As far as the war, yes, there is some evidence around the archaeological evidence around the site of Troy, which is in western Turkey. There's some evidence there was fighting, but you can find that around any city. Don't really know if there was a war. There probably was not, Achilles and Priam and Ajax and Agamemnon and characters like that. But it doesn't really matter because the Greeks used that story as a key to their mythology. The Trojan War was a way for them to illustrate human experience. Okay, so what does that have to do with the Romans? Well, hundreds of years later, Virgil begins this tale. And Aeneas has always sort of figured in Roman mythology as the city has grown and become more powerful and has taken over all of Italy and part of Spain and what is now France and Eastern Europe. It gets larger and larger. And Romans knew about Aeneas, and they knew that they thought that he played an important part in settling their city. But it was Virgil in the Aeneid that put it all down and put it together. And in doing so, he tried to tie Greek mythology with Roman. What's the point of doing that? Well, the Romans always had something of an inferiority complex to the Greeks. They felt that the Greeks had accomplished more than they had in terms of philosophy, literature, artwork. So for the Romans, it was very important to tie themselves somehow to Greece and that tradition of intellectual life and artistic life. So that's what the Aeneid did. And Virgil wrote this poem as a way to, again, tie Rome with Greece. Okay, so what I want to do is, let's talk about who Virgil is writing this poem for. I mean, yes, he's writing it for the Roman people, but really he's writing it for Augustus. Again, that's the first emperor. He is reigning while Virgil is alive. And Augustus is going to reign for a long time. He's going to reign, officially speaking, from 27 BC to 14 AD. If you do the math, that's 41 years. That's an incredibly long reign. No other Roman emperor is going to come nearly as long as far as duration goes as Augustus. Okay, so Virgil's writing this for Augustus, and politically some things are happening at the time. Augustus has won the Civil War. He's in charge now, but many Romans are still not happy about it because the Senate, while it still exists, is not as powerful as it was. The Republic is dead. And by the way, I imagine many of you are Star Wars fans. If you're wondering where George Lucas got the whole Galactic Republic turning to the Galactic Empire and Senator Palpatine becoming the Emperor, I mean, it's straight out of this. It's all Augustus. And the political maneuvering with the Senate and goading them into war, all that stuff came straight out of Roman history, right about the time we're talking about. Okay, so Augustus is in charge. The Senate has been, it exists, but it's less powerful. So Virgil is attempting to justify Augustus' reign. Now, right now, at the time we're talking about, there are three players in Roman politics. One, of course, is the emperor, or the Optimus Princeps. Okay, that's Augustus. Another is the Senate. And the third, and this is very important, is the army. And I don't want to go on and on about military stuff, even though it's my tendency to. I won't do that, but I will say that the army, from this point on, always plays a role in the Roman state. Not just because it defends it or expands it and attacks, but it also has a say in who becomes emperor. I mean, if the army isn't behind you, you're not going to be able to do it. It's great to have the Senate behind you, but the Senate, there's only 600 of them, whereas a legion has 5,500 men, and there are about 25 of them, of those legions. So obviously whoever the army backs is going to wind up emperor. Furthermore, another player at this time were, of course, even though Rome, like so many other ancient societies, was dominated by males, there were women, of course, who played a very powerful role in the Roman state. One of them was Livia, Augustus' wife. You can imagine that the emperor's wife would play a very powerful role in things. There were also wives of senators, wives of generals. And so while on one hand, it's unfortunate that few of these women had their own political base, they did have significant influence, and they did have supporters. And so powerful women, not all women unfortunately, but powerful women also played a role in determining the course of state. Okay, so back we go to Virgil. Now we've talked about how Virgil wants to connect Greece and Rome. And what he also wants to do is compare Augustus to Aeneas, and in that way also support Augustus and get the Roman people to support Augustus, because he's written this incredible tale of the founder of Rome, this man who underwent all these incredible trials and travails and wound up in Italy to found Rome. And in doing so, he wins a civil war. We did not read that part. What we read was the beginning of the poem, which is the fall of Troy, where Aeneas escapes the collapse of Troy. Then he goes on a long journey. We did not read that, and he lands in Carthage. That's where Dido is queen. We did read that. We read about Aeneas and Dido. And so then Aeneas winds up in Italy. He founds Rome. He fights a civil war with some neighboring groups, and he wins. And that's how Rome becomes established. Well, back to my original point, Virgil is trying to connect the two heroes, Aeneas and the Emperor Augustus. So Augustus has won a civil war, so Aeneas wins a civil war in Virgil's poem. So you can see what he's trying to do here. He's trying to connect Greek mythology with Roman mythology, and he's trying to justify the current political situation in Rome at the time he writes it. By the way, he wrote it between 29 and 19 BC, and Virgil died probably before the final draft of the poem was ready. And in fact, you may have read this in your text. He left instructions that the poem should be burned, but Augustus intervened and said, no, you're not going to burn it. It's part of our heritage now, and it was. The poem was an immediate, huge hit in the Latin-speaking world. I mean, at least people who could read. So right away, Rome seized on the Aeneid as its national tale. And so that's one reason the Aeneid has endured as long as it has. It has connections to ancient Greece and the epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But it also harkens to a new age with Rome and the power that will be Rome. So, okay, there are some important things about the poem and also about the qualities that Aeneas has. Roman virtue. Now, the word virtue comes from Latin, and it means positive qualities. It means a number of things at once. It's one of those words. In the Roman sense, it means that you endure your fate. You don't complain. You don't whine. It means, of course, that you are brave. It means that you are loyal, and above all, it means you do your duty. Romans don't like whiners, at least they claim not to endure whiners. And Aeneas, while he is certainly, he complains at times about the difficulties he's put into, he's not much of a whiner. He's more of a doer. And as the text points out, Aeneas, unlike a lot of ancient heroes, has to work with others. It's not just all him killing thousands of people and being heroic like, say, Gilgamesh. Instead, Aeneas has to work with others. In fact, what's very interesting is that Virgil chooses to make the great Roman hero someone who fled the losing side in a war. And that's something I'm going to put on the discussion boards for you guys to talk about. I've always been rather interested in that Virgil kind of chose the underdog from which to start his tale of Rome's glory. Okay, so back to Roman virtue and doing your duty. This is of the utmost importance. And Virgil is attempting, not only, as we've said many times, connect Greece and Rome to legitimize Augustus' reign, he's also trying to set down a core belief system. And I hate that phrase as much as you guys probably do, core beliefs. But anyway, that is what he's trying to do. He's trying to establish this is what it means to be Roman. Now, of course, again, Rome is not new when Virgil writes this poem. I mean, the city's been there for, 500 or 600 years, if not longer. But his poem plays an enormous role in setting everything down so that everybody can, to some extent, read and agree, yes, this is what it means to be Roman. Okay, so what we'll do, I think I've pretty much covered most of the things I wanted to cover when we talk about Rome and Virgil and the Aeneid. The rest of it's going to be in your text, of course. I mean, that's the main thing. And I will tell you, the Aeneid is, of the three epic poems that we think about from Greek and Roman antiquity, it's by far my favorite. A lot of people like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they're great and everything. But the Aeneid, for some reason, I really like the fact that, again, this is sort of an underdog tale of someone who is able to make something out of nothing. Now, the gods are on his side. We can't forget that. That's a slight advantage in his favor. But it's interesting that the Greeks, who have won the war, are just kind of left behind in all of this. And that may have something to do with that inferiority complex between Greece and Rome. I mean, eventually, Rome is going to annex Greece. By the time it does so, Greece is no longer at its peak. But it doesn't really matter. In the end, Greece becomes an area controlled by Rome. And that was always kind of a goal of the Romans, is sort of, if you can't outdo them, take them, or join them. I mean, many Romans viewed themselves as sort of an extension of Greek civilization. I mean, you may know the Roman gods are very similar to the Greek gods, basically the same set of gods, but renamed for the Latin. Okay, well, that's enough. We're about to finish, but what I want to do is close with, and this will be on the discussion boards as well. You didn't read the entire poem, but the poem ends with Aeneas standing over his enemy in the civil war that closes the poem. And he's standing over him, he's defeated him in battle, he's got his sword, and the opponent begs for his life. Aeneas waits for a second, he's going to spare him, nah, stabs him in the guts. And that's the very end of the poem. It's a pretty alarming ending for a lot of readers. And it leaves open the question, so what does this mean for Rome? Is Rome going to be, what? Is it going to be like a virtuous state that the world can look to for civilization? Or is it going to be a bunch of, brutal attackers that kill without mercy? In some ways, both were true. For its neighbors, it was going to be the latter for the most part. But Virgil leaves that ambiguous. I think he does that for a reason. While he doesn't want to legitimize Augustus, legitimize the Roman state, legitimize Roman mythology, he also probably has his own worries about what's going to happen in the future. I mean, we're not a republic any longer. We're now an empire. And we used to be unique with the republic, but now we're just like everybody else in the ancient world. So what's going to happen? He wasn't sure. Okay, that is enough. Thank you for your patience again. Thank you for the poor lighting, poor sound, verbal flubs, all that stuff. It's important to remember this is totally historically accurate. Romans often used bobby pins to bring their vinyl cloaks together in front. Thank you very much. I will talk to you soon.